This is Triangle Strategy, a tactics-style RPG from Square Enix that looks to bring that classic 90s top-down RPG gameplay to VR headsets. This released October 31st, 2024 for the Quest platform for $30 US, and for this review, we covered the game on the Quest 3. Square Enix dipping their toes back into VR has me excited for this title, so let's get to it, shall we? Hey folks, Ryan for the VR Grid here, and before we get to it, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe if you haven't, leave us a comment with your thoughts on this release, and if you can't get enough VR, join us every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for the Virtual Voice Podcast, where we cover all things VR. Now, on with the review. Alright, so let's be clear here, I am kind of out of touch with the flat world of gaming, having only left the headset for a few premium games, and thus was a little stoked when I heard that Square Enix was porting one of their more recent titles. Triangle Strategy originally released for the Switch in 2022, and is one of the most narrative-heavy games I've ever played. I will of course touch upon the basics of gameplay, but I'm not going to go into too much depth, as honestly, if I did, this review would be like half an hour long, as this game has a ton of elements to contend with. Long story short, you control Serenoa Wolfort, a prince in his own kingdom, with the larger world and its three kingdoms all being in a state of peace that has lasted for almost 30 years. As such, the game kind of starts off, well, pretty damn slow. I'm not gonna lie, it probably took me a solid 3 hours before I started to actually get invested in what was happening. I can't help but compare this to Game of Thrones, and it does feel quite similar in how the tale is told, and once the plot does kind of kick into gear, it's pretty engaging, but until then, roughly the 4-hour mark or so, it's kind of a slog, as the VR version does suffer from a few shortcomings. Now, your controllers essentially act like mouse pointers, allowing you to navigate the menus with relative ease, and really work quite well considering just how complex this game can be. When you get to actually play the game, you view a 3D pixel art kind of world, and can rotate the level as you want, explore it. Honestly, I'll get to the visuals, but it's pretty damn cool. However, when you're not in combat or exploring a village or whatever, the game really does just fall into sitting back and watching cutscenes that would normally just be on your TV, but in VR, they're on a scroll that appears before you with a lower res JPEG kind of behind that, so you're still in VR, but it very much is a cinematic experience, and some of these scenes can last for 5, 10, 20 minutes. There's a lot of dialogue in here, which I think will be the biggest hurdle for a lot of people curious about the game. It's these sections which definitely cause the game to start off quite slow, as you really are just sitting there listening to people talk and taking information, and new characters are introduced all the time, and kind of like Game of Thrones, maybe more so the book than the TV show, it just gets confusing as there's just so much to take in that it's hard to keep track of what actually is important. Stay the course, and eventually you get to those gameplay elements, get to the combat, and I found myself actually getting more involved with the story, and it was great. I actually cared, which is the biggest thing. Now, I will say the main characters are lackluster. They're all just a little bit too goody two-shoes, and it did kind of impact some of the choices you have to make, as the choices kind of seem like be this good or that good. But that's neither here nor there, as the overarching story is actually pretty engrossing. Now, when in the actual combat, it's all still relegated to menus and actions. Use your quest controller to point at which one to attack, or move a certain amount of spaces on the combat map. Choose from your magic powers, use items. You can equip items, you visit a vendor. All those classic top-down RPG elements are here. And there's extra levels to the combat thanks to the tactics strategy side of this thing. So if you want to gang up on somebody or get more attacks, and you can surround your foes, which triggers other attacks. Magic can be used to counter other magic. There's just a lot to contend with, but it works. The game explains a lot to you. It does it slowly, but it can feel overwhelming at times, but it still felt relatively natural to figure things out on your own. It's pretty easy to figure out that fire is going to nullify ice, that sort of thing. So while I've heard that there are other games that are more complex than this, I found the overall tactics elements in here to be fairly fair and engaging. I kind of just wish the combat happened more often than not. That being said, those battles can still take quite a while, as you're controlling 8 to 12 characters, and there's a lot going on. When not in combat, you'll be able to explore some villages or talk to your cohorts. There's a whole decision system in here that will kind of help guide the plot. So you have to talk to your friends who will kind of all vote. You can sway their votes for a decision, and then whatever decision they decide upon is where the story moves. So there's multiple paths to get to the 4 endings, and with a campaign sprawling 40 plus hours, there's a lot of game here, which is awesome, as like I said, now that I'm into this game, I am fully engrossed and can't wait to see where the story goes. I mean, I guess I should mention there's actually a fairly in-depth level up system here. There's a ton of characters to choose from. There's the main story, which of course you have to play, but there's lots of side quests you can click on as well. Almost all of that is passive and sitting back and watching it. You can upgrade your weapons and magic abilities, of course buy new stuff at vendors, and all the typical elements of any of these kind of games are all here. And as far as I'm concerned, gameplay wise, this game is on point and a ton of fun once you get past those first few hours. Now, as far as presentation goes, that's a little more of a mixed bag, as what's here was originally a flat game designed for the Switch. So bringing that from the very small screen and even a TV to VR, there is some caveats to the presentation, as things can look a little bit off. And by off, I mean sometimes you're just too close to the action. The pixel art style looks awesome, and still does in VR, but because everything is so much more closer to your head, you can see all the little discrepancies and just, all the little pixels, because they don't quite blend in as much as you'd like or even notice on other screens. As I said, a bulk of the gameplay here really isn't gameplay at all, but you just passively watching cutscenes unfold as a floating scroll literally opens and closes, displaying the next scene. Where things get funny here is the transitions from cutscene to cutscene and to gameplay, as not only does the scroll open and close when scenes change, but sometimes just fades to black, then comes back just for one quick scene, then fades to black again, then goes back to a menu. There's some transition issues here which really do impact the pacing of the game, and when it's already so slow as it is, it can be a little bit annoying. Now, when you're actually controlling Serenoa and his band of merry misfits, it plays much more like games like Demeo or Table of Tales. During the exploration missions, you can tell him where to go and freely walk around each map, and if you don't have a good view, you can always rotate the whole map entirely by just grabbing it and shifting it in your hands. That looks pretty cool. It's awesome to take in this 2D pixel art, and seeing it in VR is honestly great despite being maybe a little bit close to the action. One of the things that did hurt it was when you're close to the action, it will kind of erase some of the environment so you can see better, but I found it actually was more distracting than anything else, and I'm sure there's a better solution than what's here now, as there's some scenes where enemies will be on a tower. As you get close, the tower disappears, but you can still see the enemies, so they're just kind of floating in the air. Just weird stuff like that, which does take away from some moments of the game, but those are kind of few and far between. And for the most part, this wasn't an issue, and like I said, it's there so you can help see the battlefield. So I understand why it's happening, I just think it could be tweaked a bit better to be a little bit more immersive, so to speak. When in battle, the same things at play, only now it's a grid-based system, so you have to move your characters a certain amount of squares. Their attack range is the same thing, so they move from left to right, left to right. It's not like it's like a free form kind of thing. You can still manipulate the map as you see fit, so you can move it around to see better, zoom in close if you want, or far back. It all works wonderfully. The charm behind all the character designs and the level designs really does bypass those VR shortcomings, and makes for a game that honestly just pops in the headset almost the entire time. It's so good. The characters animate so well. The environments look fantastic. I don't want to say this game looks bad by any stretch. It being in VR and being kind of blown up so big does bring you a little bit closer than I think the developers originally intended. But overall, the presentation does overcome most of those shortcomings. Lastly would be the options for mixed reality pass-through, which is fine. It doesn't change the game at all. It just replaces that low-res JPEG with your real world. So if you want to play in your living room and, make sure your dogs aren't peeing on the couch or whatever, it's there. I didn't care for it. I actually preferred being fully immersed in VR. But for those that do want the option, it's there. And as mixed reality becomes more and more of a thing, it's probably good that it is here. Now, thankfully, when it comes to audio, most of the characters are voiced all the time. Like I said, you're sitting back and watching and listening a lot. So all those cutscenes and major events are fully voiced, which does help ease the burden of having to watch half an hour of pixel art cutscenes. Though when you're exploring some of those areas, all the voice work has been removed there and it's just reading text. But these are much shorter dialogue sections that don't last more than really a few minutes. So it's not really that big of a deal. Voice acting is fairly good, though I will admit that many of the characters, mostly your allies and Serenoa, come off as a bit wooden and a little bit too goody two-shoes if you catch my drift. For instance, every time a character might even lose their cool for a second, I don't agree with this. I'm sorry I lost my cool, let's behave like gentlemen. And that kind of repeats over and over and over again. So whenever you see these characters start to, show actual human characteristics, they quickly dial it back down to being just the goody-goody guys for the most part. The villains and some of the supporting cast are a lot more fun, eschewing much more character and depth, and do break up the story quite nicely with their machinations and everything. So while I do wish your party did have a little bit more vibrancy to it, the overarching story and narrative really do kind of make up for the lacking character in your party.
And this must be the young lord's bride-to-be.
I am Frederica. It is a pleasure. And I am Gila, her attendant.
Allow me to introduce those in service of House Wolf. This is Erador, Master-at-Arms and Commander of our military forces.
You'll be the lady of House Wolfort. No.
And this is Anna.
Music is of course on point, with action having the typical fantasy-esque beats, wandering villages or in mines. It's all here. It all sounds fantastic. I really can't complain about this at all. It does feel AAA when it comes to the audio side of things. You can tell there's a ton of work put into this. And it's cool to see that in a VR game. I know it's not built for VR, but just seeing this amount of work, this is what I want to see out of VR games. And I know this is a port. And despite this being a port, I still can't help but appreciate that quality that sometimes we're missing out of games like this in VR. So overall, I'm actually loving this game. I definitely went into it with high expectations and was a bit disappointed when the game just kind of started so slowly. It's such a slog, but sticking through it, getting past those initial few hours really does reveal a super entertaining and complex game. Tons of mechanics to contend with. You can change difficulty on the fly, which I should note, the game starts you off on very easy, which it was very easy. I actually forgot I was playing that easy until I remembered. I've since then dumped it up to easy and now playing on normal, and normal seems to be a pretty sweet spot where the game is challenging, but not to a point where it's frustrating. And it's forcing me to learn all the little mechanics that the game's been teaching me the whole time. Now, when you get these new mechanics, they're just like text bubbles that pop up and explain things with pictures, which isn't great. Reading in VR is never fun, and there is a fair bit of text in here you have to read to kind of learn all the nuances of the game. Not overbearing, it's just initially it's a lot, but some of it's pretty obvious. Other stuff, you can always go back and reference it later on in the options menu. The game gives you plenty of reasons to explore each area that you can, finding hidden loot and items that can be used or traded at the vendor. I am keen on going back and actually playing through this a second time, just to see the different choices I can make and see where the plot might go. There's an autosave system in here, though you can do up to 10 manual saves. So if you do a bit of research and want to get those 4 endings, you can make a save for those specific moments and not have to replay the entire game. Though honestly, I'm looking forward to playing the entire game again. It is a fun title to see what choices will take you where, and the plot is very in-depth. Like I said, I can't help but compare it to Game of Thrones, and while it might not be as complicated as those books get, it's still fairly in-depth and a lot of fun. And that really is the takeaway here. As long as you're cool with kind of sitting back and watching cutscenes and obviously engaging in some fairly complex gameplay, especially more and more as the game goes on, you're gonna have a blast with this. I know I am. I'm gonna give Triangle Strategy for the Quest 3 an 8 out of 10. It has some VR shortcomings, but this is still a ton of fun, and it's awesome to see Square Enix port games like this to VR. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to do all the YouTube things to help us out. And that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching.